The 1920s. The 1920s began with the Red Scare, sparked by the Communist Revolution of 1917 in Russia. Americans feared that the Russians had communist spies in America who were working to spread communism around the world. And it is true that there were some communists in America. This came out of World War I. Even in 1917 and 1918, we passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts, aimed not only at targeting spies who posed an immediate threat to national security, but also targeting sedition, speaking out against the government. You should also be aware that the Palmer raids and the many arrests that were carried out, I like to refer to this period as the Red Scare Part 1, because we'll see that after World War II, we'll be talking about yet another Red Scare. So stay tuned for Red Scare Part 2. This was also a time of the migration of African Americans from the rural South into cities, especially in the North. They were often drawn to the cities by industrial jobs, especially during the World War. And we'll see that the same took place during World War II. They did find new opportunities in their new homes, but they also encountered prejudice. Prejudice, of course, was not only in the South, it was to be found throughout America. There was also the fact of segregation in the cities. But these African American communities gave rise to the Harlem Renaissance and the NAACP, as African American communities trained professionals, doctors, and lawyers. This would set the stage for the civil rights movement decades later. Sometimes the 1920s are referred to as a time of normalcy. President Harding coined this phrase, normalcy, meaning normality. But I guess if you're president, you can say a word incorrectly and invent a new word yourself. What did he mean by normalcy? In some ways, the 1920s were an attempt to return to the way things had been previously to World War I. I'll give you two examples of that. One is when it comes to foreign policy. This yearning for isolationism. First, let me be clear. After World War I, the United States was not entirely isolationist. We didn't cut ourselves off from the rest of the world, but in some ways, we were showing a desire to retreat from national affairs in such a way as to avoid being entangled in such a war again. One example is the Washington Conference. We were involved in meeting with leaders from around the world and trying to avoid future wars. The 553 Treaty was a disarmament treaty where the United States, England, and Japan agreed to keep naval armaments at the ratio of 5 for the United States, 5 tons for England, 3 tons for Japan. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was an attempt to, get this, outlaw war. Of course, that was a failure, but this is an example of the lengths to which we and other nations were going to try to retreat from the crusading mentality in World War I. Manchuria is another example. When this territory between Russia and China was invaded by Japan, the United States spoke out against it, but was unwilling to do anything about it. This attitude of normalcy is also seen in economic policy, laissez-faire economics to be specific. The Republican presidents of this time period, like Harding, Coolidge, and then later on Herbert Hoover, certainly believed in laissez-faire economics. They thought that the progressivism of the past had led to too much government involvement in the economy, and that the best thing for the economy was for the government to have a laissez-faire or hands-off approach and let capitalism lead to prosperity on its own. This view is also held by Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury, who believed in cutting taxes in order to stimulate economic growth. This was also a time in which some attempted to build up labor unions and encountered quite a bit of opposition. You can read about several well-known strikes, and very often the strikes ended up not in the favor of the labor unions. So when it comes to foreign policy and economics, the 1920s were a time of normalcy. Although it's impossible to turn back the clock, in many ways Americans were trying to get back to business as usual. But in other ways, the 20s were just as much a time of, may I say, not so normalcy, of rapid change. This is evident in the area of popular culture. The 1920s were a time of mass production, mass consumption, and exciting new inventions were gaining popularity. Automobiles, for example, were becoming much more widespread throughout the 1920s. Advertising, installment buying, celebrities like Charles Lindbergh making the first solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean on an airplane. This was not so normal, all of these rapid advancements. Mass media. This was a time of radio, movies, the new jazz style music, and along with all of this mass media, mass communication, came a certain degree of homogenization. Not that American communities were entirely isolated before, but more than ever, people were listening to the same music all across the nation. They were watching the same movies, sharing a popular culture. Other changes in the 1920s were more controversial, such as the New Morality, or the philosophy that things which in the past had been considered immoral were now okay. This was a time of prohibition. Ironically, although alcohol was illegal, there was a rapid growth of speakeasies and bootlegging. This was the time of Al Capone and other gangsters. So people certainly were still drinking, it just wasn't legal. Cigarettes, or smokes, were becoming more popular. Sure, people had smoked before this time, pipes, cigars, and so on, but cigarettes were becoming much more popular. And they were more accepted, not only among men, but young women flappers were also turning to cigarettes. This was partly due to cigarette companies sending free cigarettes to soldiers during World War I. Obviously, they were in a very stressful situation. Imagine spending months in the trenches, and many of these troops returned home hooked on cigarettes. It was certainly a good investment for the companies, but from the perspective of helping out the troops, well, I'll let you think about that. This was also a time of extravagance. You may have read The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which was a critique of the 1920s. There was plenty of prosperity, luxury, and extravagance, but many believed that underneath all the glitter was a great deal of emptiness and vanity. The 1920s was a time of flappers. This goes along with the image of the new woman. Flappers wore shorter skirts than before. We're comparing and contrasting to the Victorian style before this time, where skirts were expected to come down to the ankles. By today's standards, flappers didn't wear very short clothing, but compare them to those who came before, and there's quite a difference. You may have already known this, maybe not, but the Victorians had such long tablecloths to cover the legs of the tables for much the same reason. They thought legs were immodest. They even called table legs table limbs. So this will give you some idea of the not so normalcy of the 1920s. Flappers bobbed their hair, cutting it off short, another break with the past. Along with this new woman was also a sexual revolution, and as I said before, there was controversy over Margaret Sanger's work, partly for this reason. The 1920s was also a decade of clashing values, and the Scopes trial illustrated the deep conflict between humanism and fundamentalism. Fundamentalists believe that the Bible is literally true, the inspired Word of God. That most certainly includes the biblical account of creation, where God created the world in 6 days, approximately 6,000 years ago. But by the early 20s, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was gaining acceptance. In response, some states like Tennessee passed laws that banned teaching the theory in public schools. Some, like William Jennings Bryan, believed that the theory of evolution was contributing to racist attitudes that were being used to justify violence, like in World War I, against groups of people who supposedly hadn't evolved as far as others. When John Scopes, a high school teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, challenged the law, the trial attracted national attention. Both attorneys in the case had celebrity status. William Jennings Bryan for the prosecution, and Clarence Darrow for the defense. In the end, Scopes was found guilty and fined, but the ruling was later overturned. The significance was the national debate that surrounded the trial, where the issue seemed to be much bigger, creation versus evolution. The Scopes trial certainly didn't settle the matter to the satisfaction of all Americans. Matters of faith can't be settled in court, and both perspectives are based on faith. Think about it. Creationists and evolutionists interpret the same evidence in different ways based on their worldview. Imagine that Brian is cross-examining Darrow and asks if he can produce the missing link. Of course he can't, but he still believes that one must exist because without a creator, in his worldview, he thinks man must have evolved without him. On the other hand, what if Darrow, examining Brian, asked what he had to say about a rock or fossil scientists claimed was billions of years old? Even if Brian was willing to put confidence in the scientist's methods, would that settle the matter? Brian believed that God created a full-grown man and woman, Adam and Eve, and when he said, "Let there be light," it didn't take years for it to reach the earth and grow plants. Why then couldn't he have made an old rock? Besides, Brian might point to his belief in a universal flood that could have caused fluctuations in natural processes. The Scopes trial exposed a fault line of values in American society, showing that 1920s America wasn't monolithic, but a world where fundamentalists and humanists coexisted. Even Christians themselves were divided over liberal theology.